The catamaran had rotten deck core just ahead of the cabin on both pontoons. And instead of cutting out the balsa from above, somebody decided to cut the core out from below. And then after that, somebody glued a piece of plywood to the ceiling to hide the hole. And that section of deck was always really soft when Trevor had the boat, because the plywood wasn't really shoved all the way up against the deck. So what I'm doing right now is making a cardboard template in the shape of the hole after I've removed the plywood. And I'm going to use the cardboard to trace out this shape on a piece of honeycomb core and cut the core to the shape of the hole. And hopefully it'll be the exact shape of the hole and maybe just a ½ inch or so smaller so that it will fit nicely in the hole. And then I plan to use thickened resin to glue it to the ceiling and hold it in place with a bunch of sticks that I cut to just the right length to wedge between the floor and the ceiling. And once that resin is hardened, I can come back and fill in the hole around the edge of my patch. So that's the plan. And this is the cardboard template that I'm making to start the process. And this is the piece of Nidacore that I've cut to the exact shape of the hole. I'm going to do a test fit, trim the edge just a little bit to get it exactly the right size. And now I've taken it back to the garage to laminate both sides with fiberglass. I lay the core on top of the glass and trace the shape so that I can cut the shape of the core out of the fiberglass. And I let the fiberglass run long by maybe ½ inch or so on each side, so it's not a problem lining it up when I want to actually put it back on the core and soak it with resin. And it helps to roll up the fiberglass. It just makes it easier to roll it back out without having too much problem with wrinkles and stuff. So I wet out the core first, then lay the fiberglass over the top, and now I'm wetting out the fiberglass. You can see the resin change color as it's mixed. It starts out a very light brown, almost pinkish sometimes. And once the hardener has mixed in enough, it turns sort of a darker brown, almost like root beer. And once that color change has happened, you know the resin's going to kick. So once the fiberglass is hardened on one side, I flip the core over and do the other side. So I'm cutting the sticks to length now, getting them just a little bit longer than the space between the floor and the ceiling, so it's easier to jam them in place when the time comes. So the time has come, and I've painted the ceiling with resin, and I've tried to spread some of the thickened resin on the ceiling, but it likes to drip off pretty badly. But fortunately, having the core underneath, it dripped onto the core. So I spread the thickened resin out some more on the core before sticking it to the ceiling. And this is where having my boards cut to a convenient length comes in handy. I'm really trying to wedge it in so it's shoved against the ceiling hard in a lot of places. And now it's the next day and the resin has hardened. And for the most part, it turned out pretty good. There's this spot where the piece that I cut, the nidacor this was cut out of wasn't quite big enough. So I'm going to patch in a little triangular piece here. And you can see the gap around the edge. And before I can do tabbing, I'm going to have to get rid of some of these lumps. And I'll fill in probably with thickened resin around most of the edge. There is one spot where it's bowed down. The edge of the hole caught the piece of core and didn't let it go up against the ceiling. And where I'm pointing is sort of a bubble. And I'm cutting out around the edge there so I can get better access. And what I'm going to do is, because most of it is glued down pretty well, I'm going to fill that void with spray foam, which should adhere to the deck up above and the core below, and hopefully be the equivalent of basically a piece of foam core. So here is the template for that missing little triangle of core that I need to add. And after a little bit of trimming, it fits in there just perfectly. So I think I'm going to try this a little bit differently. I'm going to make a little bit more super pooky, and I'm going to try and, when I mix the resin, I think I'm going to wet out this part of the ceiling and then mix in the thickener to make it into pooky. And then I can smear a bunch of it on the top of this piece and shove it in place and hold it with the stick without putting fiberglass on either side of this nidacor, because the deck up above will be the fiberglass laminated to it, and the pooky, that's going to get a grip on this scrim just as good as like fiberglass, if not better. And that'll leave the scrim on the underside free for when I start laying fiberglass over the top of this to encapsulate all of this. So there's no point in me laying glass on both sides of this to make it less flexible and then laying a bunch of glass later. So I'm marking that spot where the bubble was and knocking some resin chunks off the wall. And now I'm going around and putting tape over that gap at the edge of my core patch. And the part that's closest to the camera around that triangular piece, and some of the worst areas were filled in with thickened resin. But the areas where I'm putting tape will have this great stuff gap filler spray foam. The tape actually makes a mold for the foam. So I can spray the foam in behind the tape, basically into that gap between my piece of core and the rest of the deck. And when I get to the spot where there's that big bubble, I'm just going to throw in the rest of the can. And hopefully the pressure from the expanding foam will force it out between my piece of core and the deck, and not force my repair away from the deck or create too much pressure. We'll see tomorrow. Okay, a tour of what we've done so far. I can see through the nitocore a bit that the foam is all through here, which hopefully is fairly solid. And this is in here nice. This still needs to be sanded. I can feel a ridge there. This is filled in with thickened resin. All along here and like in there. And then there's spray foam. And there's some gaps, right? Something should be there. This whole corner up here, I should really wall that off with tape and make a huge radius there and just sort of lose it. There's no point in keeping that corner. And the fiberglass here is absolutely terrible, if you can see. And another gap there. This bit here is concave, should be really filled in. Let's see, going around here, there's more gap to fill up there. Right, this. Instead of going up to the original ceiling, this should just be foam straight across from this to the wall. All through here. And the same thing here. Right, see how that's... This was the original ceiling. And forget that, just straight across.
fill it in all the way back.